Okay, so in this video, I'm going to be going over different ways to approach the reading of literature in foreign languages. For the past couple of years, I've experimented with various approaches for languages such as French, German, Italian, Spanish, and I find that there's a dearth of information regarding this topic on the internet. I also find that the vast majority of information that does exist on this topic is either trivial or just not helpful at all. So the goal of this video is to hopefully cover this gap and provide some useful information. Okay, so first, some basic principles and assumptions. First, I'm going to assume that you're possibly at an intermediate level and maybe stuck at the intermediate plateau, where most learner content is too easy, but most native content still far too difficult. Second, I'm going to advocate the use of real paper books, as there are real drawbacks to reading on electronic devices. If you're not convinced, I'd recommend the book The Shallows by Nicholas Carr. Third, I'm going to assume that you want to read real literature and the classics in your target language, which tend to be the most difficult books because they assume knowledge of the culture and a very wide vocabulary. Fourth, I'm going to advocate reading out loud, as this allows you to practice pronunciation, build your internal reading voice, and it also helps you pay attention to the text. And lastly, I'm going to assume your goal is to read fluently in your target language, just as you would read English or whatever your native language is. And in order to accomplish this, you're going to need to know about 20,000 word families, which is no small task. To my knowledge, there are approximately 6 methods for building a solid reading knowledge in a foreign language. And how I'm going to approach this is by giving a description of each of these methods and then explain how to combine these in order to obtain the smoothest path to reading fluency. Method number 1 is bilingual text. These usually come as short novels or collections of short stories with the original language on the left-hand side and a translation into your native language on the right-hand side. It goes without saying that these are pretty handy tools. The best way of using these is to read a chunk of the text in the language of instruction and then read the same chunk of text in your target language. How long this chunk of text is depends on your level in the language. It can range from a single sentence to a whole chapter, depending on how difficult the text is. It's also best to read the bilingual text 2 or 3 times. By your second or third reading, you should be able to read the target language text with minimal reference to the translation on the facing page. The one caveat, though, is that bilingual texts for some language are either really hard to find or totally non-existent. But if you're learning a relatively popular language like French, Spanish, German, Italian, Russian, bilingual texts are pretty easy to find. Method number 2 is extensive reading. This one's become really popular in recent years thanks to the work of people like Stephen Krashen or Paul Nation. The foundation of this approach is Krashen's famous I+1, where I is your current level and +1 is the level above your current one. For Krashen, the only way to make progress in your target language is to consume content that is just slightly above your level of comprehension, hence I+1, so that the language acquisition device in your brain does the work of filling in the blanks, thereby allowing you to gradually acquire language without the need for explicit grammar and vocabulary instruction. In terms of reading literature, I+1 usually corresponds to 98% comprehension of the text, so that for every 50 words, 1 is unknown to you. At this level, you should be able to figure out most unknown words from context and therefore slowly build up your vocabulary. Therefore, the point is to start with literature that is slightly above your level, aiming for 98% comprehension. And this may very well be YA fiction or airport crime novels, depending on your level. You will gradually be able to move on to harder and harder works until you're able to read the classics. This method usually requires purchasing a whole slew of progressively more difficult books, and this has the consequent drawback of you having to read a lot of not so great novels. Method number 3 is what I'd call the translation method. This is by far the most effective method, in my opinion, of building reading ability in a foreign language, especially once you've run out of bilingual texts. This method requires the acquisition of a book you would like to read in your target language and a translation of this same book to your native language. For example, you buy Der Tod in Venedig, or Death in Venice by Thomas Mann in German, and also a copy of this book in English. Since after a certain point you run out of bilingual text to read, this is the next best thing. First, you read a chunk of the translation, whether it be a page, 10 pages, a chapter, or the entire book. Then read the exact same chunk of text in your target language. Your comprehension will improve greatly by virtue of having read text first in your native language. It's also optional whether you want to refer back to the translation when you still can't figure out a word or a sentence, or whether you want to continue reading without breaking the flow. Personally, I've always opted for the latter since it interrupts the flow of reading less and it allows you to cover more volume in your target language. As you continue to use this method, it's ideal to make the chunks of text longer and longer. You can start with, say, a page and then move on to 10 pages after you've read a few more books and so on. After using this method for a certain length of time, you'll begin to realize that you'll just be able to read books independently in your target language. At this point, you can throw away most methods and continue developing your language skill by reading what you want. Of course, have to make word lookups here and there, and you'll still have to guess unknown words through context, but at this point, you've effectively surpassed the need for any of these methods. Method number 4 is primers and graded readers. Primers can be a useful aid in reading a foreign language. This especially applies to languages like Old English, where primers usually constitute the only reading material. One can use primers up to a certain point, but eventually have to switch to other methods, especially because they're pretty rare. And I'm not going to dwell on primers here because 1, they're not that important, and 2, they only really matter if you're learning a language like Old English or Old French, where already from the start there's very little material to read. And usually primers are just glorified graded readers with a glossary, and the texts tend to be much more difficult, so you have to go through the grammar and the vocabulary. Method number 5 is called intensive reading. This is usually regarded as the competitor to extensive reading, an image most people conjure up in their mind when they imagine reading in a foreign language, i.e. slogging through a text with a dictionary in hand and meticulously noting down every unknown word. There's not anything in particular to say about this method, as it's pretty self-explanatory. However, when I do intensive reading, I tend to note the word down in the text with a pencil, and despite the bad reputation of this method in some crowds, it does work and people have been using it for centuries, so there's not really much else to say about this. It works, except it's just really slow. The final method is called realistic reading. I'm not going to go into any detail because Alexander Arguelles has already made an excellent video on this method that he invented himself. But the gist is basically that it's a combination of intensive and extensive reading, so it allows you to still make dictionary lookups while also covering more volume than if you were to look up every single word in the dictionary. So, as for my recommended approach, basically what I'm going to recommend is that you acquire a set of bilingual texts and read through them in the way I already described. And once you've run out of bilingual texts to read, you'll probably have greatly improved in your reading ability. If you're learning a language with lots of bilingual text, there's no reason to stop using this method until you run out. But if you can only acquire a handful of these, I'd recommend switching to the translation method above. How long you will need to stick with this method depends on your experience, the closeness of this language to other languages you already know, and several other factors such as how long per day you dedicate to reading. However, for most Germanic and Romance languages, you can reach a pretty solid reading knowledge, but by no means fluency, within 3 to 4 years of practice. And by this time, you'll probably have abandoned most methods and you'll just be reading whatever texts you want. And for other languages, it might take double or triple the time. And furthermore, you can reduce the amount of time it takes by dedicating more time to your target language. For example, instead of reading for an hour a day, you can read 2 or 3. In conclusion, I hope this guide was helpful in providing newer learners a way to approach the reading of literature in foreign languages. After learning to read well in 1 or 2 languages, this is really a transferable skill. So if you want to go on to read a 3rd or 4th language with fluency, this is basically a trivial task and it's only a matter of time. And there's no skill required because you're basically just applying the same method you already used with other languages to this new language.